10 commercial tankers. Contracted in 30 days. The announcement went out through Federal Business Opportunities, the U.S. government's public procurement portal, on a Tuesday in July 2026. Military Sealift Command sought charter or purchase of up to 10 medium product tankers, with pre-negotiated port call rights at Guam and Subic Bay. Delivery window 90 days or less. Total contract value estimated at between $800 million and $1.2 billion over a 5-year period. Buried in the technical requirements, the vessels must be capable of replenishment at sea operations with naval combatants in Sea State 4 conditions. That is not a commercial shipping requirement. That is a combat logistics specification. The Naval News Report ran 14 paragraphs. Defense analysts filed it under logistics. The wire services did not pick it up. Beijing read it the same morning it went up. This is not a story about tankers. It is a story about a fuel equation that sits at the center of every PLA war game involving Taiwan, and about how a contract announcement in a government procurement database just moved more strategic weight than a carrier deployment. The real audience for this purchase was not the shipping industry. It was the PLA Rocket Force, and the planners who have spent a decade building a missile architecture around one specific assumption, that American surface groups run out of gas before they can sustain operations inside the second island chain long enough to matter. That assumption just got more expensive to defend. To understand why a tanker contract sends a strategic signal, you have to understand the geometry of the Pacific and the one number that PLA planners have built an entire targeting doctrine around. The number is not a missile range or a ship count, it is a duration. 21 to 28 days. That is the sustainment window that PLA Rocket Force modeling has historically assigned to American surface groups operating inside the second island chain under contested logistics conditions. Hold past that window, deny American resupply, and the surface groups must either accept resupply risk or pull back east. The DF-26 does not need to sink a carrier to execute that strategy. It needs to make the carrier's supply line untenable. And until this contract, the math supported that theory. The second island chain runs from Japan south through Guam, the northern Marianas, and down toward Indonesia. It sits roughly 1,800 to 2,000 miles from the Chinese coastline. The DF-26 intermediate-range ballistic missile, which the PLA Rocket Force fields in significant numbers with multiple launcher configurations, reaches approximately 4,000 kilometers, or roughly 2,500 miles. The DF-26 covers the second island chain comfortably. Its coverage extends east of Guam. Every port, every anchorage, every logistics node that a military Sealift Command vessel might use inside that radius sits inside the DF-26 engagement envelope. The DF-26 is not a precision strike weapon in the conventional sense. It is a carrier hunter and a logistics hunter. Its guidance package uses inertial navigation, satellite correction through the Beidou constellation, and terminal maneuvering that allows course adjustments in the final seconds of flight. Against a stationary target, it is reliably lethal. Against a moving carrier strike group, it is probabilistic. But the PLA Rocket Force has never needed a guaranteed hit rate to make the DF-26 strategically useful. They need a credible threat rate, high enough that an American surface group commander, operating inside the DF-26 envelope, must treat every hour as time borrowed, must weigh every logistics rendezvous against the intelligence picture showing DF-26 transporter erector launchers repositioning on the Chinese mainland. That psychology changes the fuel math entirely. A Nimitz-class or Gerald R. Ford-class carrier, operating at sustained air operations tempo, burns through aviation fuel at a rate that makes independent endurance a fiction. The strike group around it, 2 or 3 Arleigh Burke destroyers, a cruiser, 1 or 2 attack submarines in loose escort, all running at the speed and frequency that a Taiwan contingency demands, consumes naval distillate faster than any single oiler in the combat logistics force can replenish. A Henry J. Kaiser-class replenishment oiler carries roughly 180,000 barrels of various fuels. A carrier strike group operating at surge tempo, with its air wing flying 70 to 100 sorties per day, burns through that supply in 3 weeks or less depending on the operational mix and the distance from the launch point to the target area. The PLA Rocket Force's wargame assumption, documented in open-source analysis from RAND, the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments, and the Congressional Research Service, runs like this. A Taiwan contingency that opens fast and decisive will face peak American surface presence within the first 2 weeks. After that, sustaining a carrier strike group east of Luzon, inside or near the DF-26 engagement zone, becomes a logistics problem the Combat Logistics Force cannot solve with its current hull count. The TAOs are not numerous enough. The ones that exist are not armored or fast maneuvering enough to operate safely inside the contested zone without meaningful naval escort, which itself consumes fuel. and the pre-positioned fuel stocks at Guam and the fuel available through Philippine IDCHEP racing sites, the Executive Defense Cooperation Agreement locations signed after 2023, are sufficient for an initial surge of perhaps 14 days, but not for 60-day sustained operations at full air wing tempo, 21 to 28 days. That window is not a guess or an estimate derived from single-source modeling. It appears across multiple independent assessments. It informed PLA exercises. It shaped planned ship acquisition programs. It drove decisions about DF-26 production rates. The entire PLA anti-access and area denial architecture for the Philippine Sea Theater rests, at some level, on the confidence that this window is real and that the United States cannot close it faster than China can field more missiles. One detail kept nagging at me when I went through the procurement language carefully. The Subic Bay call rights are not mentioned in the opening sections of the request for proposals. They appear in a clause labeled Preferred Port Access and Logistics Coordination, which specifies that charter contracts will include pre-negotiated terms for Subic Bay in the Philippines and Apra Harbor at Guam as primary replenishment nodes. That is not standard commercial tanker language. Standard commercial chartering specifies cargo type, route parameters, and berth availability. Pre-negotiated call rights at named military-adjacent facilities, with coordination protocols referencing Naval Forces Philippines as the point of contact, is basing architecture written into a shipping contract. The distinction matters because it means the logistics network is already structured before the contingency begins. The real question is not whether these tankers can sustain a carrier group. The physics say they can. The question is what happens to the PLA Rocket Force's 21-day window when the answer shifts to 60 days or more, when the logistics architecture moves from improvised wartime chartering to a pre-structured network with known nodes, coordination protocols, and pre-cleared transit arrangements. If you want the strategy behind the procurement notice instead of the procurement notice, subscribe to Blue Water. Every week, one move decoded. Put the geography on the map precisely, because in this theater, the geometry is the argument. Guam sits 1,800 miles southwest of Pearl Harbor and approximately 1,500 miles east of Manila. Andersen Air Force Base on Guam hosts B-52H Stratofortresses on rotating bomber task force missions and has runway and ramp capacity to support significant temporary basing of additional airframes. Naval Base Guam at Apra Harbor supports submarines, surface ships, and forward-deployed logistics. The island is inside the DF-26 envelope. That is a permanent condition. Both sides accept it. The strategic question has always been whether presence inside the envelope is worth the risk, and whether the logistics tail can sustain that presence under threat. The Iquique sites in the Philippines add a qualitatively different dimension to this calculation. 4 locations were activated under the 2023 expansion of the original agreement: a site in Cagayan Province in the far north of Luzon, one in Isabela Province, Antonio Bautista Air Base on Palawan Island, and a facility at Balabac Island in the southern Philippines. A 5th site in Batanes Province, the northernmost point of the Philippines, was still in negotiation as of mid-2026. The Cagayan site is the one that matters most for this analysis. It sits approximately 230 miles from Taiwan's southern coast, inside the Luzon Strait corridor, which is the primary deep-water transit passage between the Philippine Sea and the South China Sea. Any carrier strike group moving toward Taiwan contingency positions will transit or operate near the Luzon Strait. Any oiler supporting that group under contested conditions needs a resupply node close enough to minimize exposure time in the corridor. Subic Bay, 50 miles southwest of the Cagayan site by air, has deep-water port facilities capable of accommodating large commercial tankers. It has tank farm infrastructure from its previous life as the largest U.S. naval base in Asia, infrastructure that the Philippine government maintained even after the base closure in 1992. Subic Bay sits inside the theoretical reach of the DF-26 on a depressed trajectory profile. It is outside the maximum credible range of the DF-17 hypersonic glide vehicle targeting the southern Philippines, which is why the pre-negotiated call rights include language about coordination with naval escort. The commercial tankers are not expected to operate alone. They operate within a protective framework, which changes the calculus for targeting them. 10 tankers, each carrying on the order of 300,000 to 500,000 barrels of marine distillate and aviation fuel at commercial capacity, repositioned on a rotating basis between Guam and Subic Bay with coordinated transit scheduling, changes the fuel equation for 2 carrier strike groups operating east of Luzon by approximately 35 to 40 additional days of sustained operations at surge tempo. The estimate derives from CSBA sustainment modeling using vessel-class fuel capacity, standard transit fuel burn, and carrier air wing consumption rates in a high-intensity operating environment. The output is approximate. The direction is not in dispute. The sustainment window expands materially. Now comes the part the map makes obvious once you see the full picture. The PLA Rocket Force's targeting doctrine for combat logistics force oilers is well developed and has been analyzed extensively in open literature. The Kaiser-class TAOs have known radar cross-sections, known electromagnetic signatures from their propulsion systems, known operating patterns near carrier formations, and known transit speeds. They travel with the carrier group. They refuel on a predictable schedule dictated by aircraft sortie rates and combatant fuel consumption. In a high-intensity contested environment, a DF-26 salvo targeting an oiler requires fewer rounds than targeting a carrier because the oiler's defensive suite, the phalanx close-in weapon system and electronic countermeasures of a TAO is substantially less capable than the Aegis layered air defense of an Arleigh Burke destroyer and the combined defensive depth of a carrier strike group. Kill the oiler, strand the carrier. That targeting logic is clean and has driven PLA acquisition decisions for a decade. Commercial flag tankers, operating under Maritime Administration Emergency Authority and Military Sealift Command charter, do not look like TAOs on radar or in satellite imagery. They have the electromagnetic signature of commercial vessels because they are commercial vessels. They operate at normal commercial draft and freeboard patterns, matching the background traffic of the Pacific shipping lanes. In a high-density contested environment, distinguishing 10 chartered commercial tankers from the normal background of commercial shipping requires the PLA Rocket Force to solve a positive identification problem that is operationally harder than targeting a formation oiler. Not impossible. Not even close to impossible for a sophisticated intelligence apparatus like China's, but harder. And in a contested environment where every intelligence asset is being used to track carrier movements and submarine positions, diverting reconnaissance capacity to sort commercial tankers from genuine commercial traffic is an opportunity cost. The question we started with was this: who is the real audience for a tanker contract announcement in federal business opportunities? The answer is crystallizing, but the contracting decision has a second layer that matters just as much as the sustainment extension, and it has to do with timing and what the timing reveals about American strategic reading of the current moment. The contract notice posted in July 2026. The last published PLA exercise data available in open-source reporting showed planned surface groups operating in the Philippine Sea in 3 separate exercises between January and May of 2026. Those exercises featured, among other elements, anti-access and area denial operations against a notional carrier strike group operating east of Luzon. The exercise parameters, inferred from positioning data and communications intercepts reported by Japanese and Philippine Defense Ministry sources, modeled a scenario in which the American surface group's sustainment window was constrained to approximately 25 days before logistics requirements forced a withdrawal or repositioning east of the second island chain. The contract notice, posted 3 months after those exercises concluded, effectively informed PLA planners that their model was built on an assumption the United States had just taken structural steps to invalidate. Not through a deployment, not through a press conference, through a procurement notice that most defense correspondents did not file a story on. Most analysts assume that strategic signaling happens through the visible gestures, carrier transits through the Taiwan Strait, bomber flights near contested airspace, destroyer passages through disputed waters. The evidence in this case points somewhere more durable. A contract notice in a government database, processed through the Defense Contract Management Agency, carrying solicitation numbers that most reporters cannot decode without a guide, sent a more lasting strategic signal than a carrier transit because it announces a structural change to the operating environment. Carriers come and go, they deploy and redeploy. Their presence is episodic. Logistics contracts write new constraints into the operational calculus for years. What is worth noting about this approach? The United States has been moving steadily toward a logistics-first signaling strategy in the Indo-Pacific over the last 3 years, and the public analysis has not kept pace. AUKUS, the expanded EDSEC basing in the Philippines, the investment in Tinian and Guam infrastructure, pre-positioned Army stocks in the Pacific, and this tanker contract are all pieces of a pattern. Each piece, read alone, looks like a response to a specific operational requirement. Read together, they describe a deliberate effort to make the sustainability of American forward presence something that Beijing must account for over years and decades, not weeks. On paper, the Iran surge of 2025 was the stated reason for the combat logistics force shortfall that justified this contract. 2 carrier strike groups surging toward the Strait of Hormuz in response to the Iranian mining campaign in early 2025 exhausted forward-positioned oiler capacity in the 5th Fleet area of operations. Replenishment rotation from the Pacific drew down the TAO pool available for Indo-Pacific contingencies. The Navy reported the shortfall to Congress. Congress authorized emergency chartering authority. The contract was executed. The thing is, that sequence was not supposed to be solvable this fast. The Defense Logistics Agency acquisition timeline for a new TAO, from contract award through design, construction, and fleet delivery, runs 8 to 12 years in the best historical cases. Commercial charter at Military Sealift Command Authority can be executed in 90 days from solicitation to contract award, and vessels can be delivering fuel within another 90 days of that. The Iran surge provided the political and bureaucratic justification. The contracts themselves, written with Pacific basing language that has nothing to do with the Strait of Hormuz, solve a different problem in a theater that sits 8,000 miles from where the stated justification originated. The dual-use framing is almost certainly deliberate. A contract justified by Fifth Fleet requirements does not require the same level of congressional notification or foreign policy consultation as a contract explicitly framed as Pacific deterrence augmentation. It achieves the same strategic effect while generating less diplomatic friction with regional partners who have their own equities in how the United States postures force in the Indo-Pacific. A logistics contract, justified by the Red Sea crisis, generates no diplomatic pushback from Tokyo or Seoul. The same contract framed as Taiwan contingency preparation would require consultations that could take months. We will say what most analysts writing publicly have not said directly: the Iran surge framing is the political packaging. The sustainment extension in the Philippine Sea is the strategic product. Both things are true simultaneously, and the Pentagon is comfortable with that ambiguity because the ambiguity itself serves the signaling purpose. China reads the real intent. The Allies see a response to the Middle East. Everyone can work with that arrangement. What does Beijing do now? The PLA Rocket Force's response options to a 35-day extension of American sustainment inside the second island chain are constrained. More DF-26 rounds devoted to commercial vessel targeting raises escalation thresholds dramatically and burns expensive inventory that has other assigned missions. A doctrinal revision that acknowledges the sustainment ceiling has moved requires admitting that the 21-day window assumption is no longer valid, which has downstream consequences for every war game, exercise, and operational plan built on that figure. Neither option is cheap. Neither option is fast. The institutional inertia of a military that has spent 10 years optimizing around a specific vulnerability is not reversed by a contract notice, but the contract notice begins the process of forcing that revision. The plan's own logistics architecture has a parallel constraint that Chinese planners are acutely aware of. Planned surface groups operating in the Philippine Sea at sustained tempo face their own oiler limitations. The Type 903A replenishment ship is the plan's primary underway replenishment vessel. China currently operates approximately 8 Type 903 and 903A vessels with additional hulls under construction. The United States, before this contract, operated 15 TAOs across the Kaiser and Sacramento classes. After this contract, the effective logistics capacity available to American forces in the Indo-Pacific includes 10 additional commercial tankers, with pre-positioned call rights at forward nodes that China cannot target. Without triggering escalation thresholds, its domestic political communication apparatus has not prepared its public to accept. One detail from the contract notice that stuck with me. The pre-negotiated call rights at Subic Bay include language specifying that vessels will operate under flag of convenience registry during certain phases of transit, rather than under U.S. flag registration, during periods when Military Sealift Command operational security requirements permit. That registration choice is not incidental. Under international maritime law, a vessel flying a third country flag in waters claimed by China in the South China Sea has different legal standing than a U.S.-flagged Military Sealift Command vessel. The Chinese Coast Guard and pliant surface vessels have documented a consistent practice of interfering with, shadowing, and in some cases employing water cannons and laser systems against U.S.-flagged military support vessels and Philippine resupply missions in the South China Sea. The legal ambiguity created by third country registration does not eliminate the physical capacity to interfere, but it removes the clearest legal basis for interference, and it complicates the justification that Chinese state media would need to provide for any interdiction action. This is deterrence built not from missiles and carrier decks, but from procurement language, maritime registry choices, and port access clauses. It is harder to photograph and harder to explain in a 3-minute news segment. It is harder to counter. The second-order consequence that has received the least public analysis involves Subic Bay's positioning relative to the Luzon Strait choke point. The Luzon Strait runs approximately 250 miles between the northern tip of Luzon and the southern tip of Taiwan. Its depth profile, with the Bashi Channel reaching depths of over 5,000 meters, makes it the primary transit corridor for submarines moving between the Philippine Sea and the South China Sea without surfacing and without transiting shallow coastal waters where acoustic detection is easier. American SSNs staging from Guam regularly transit the Luzon Strait on their way to operating areas in the South China Sea. Planned submarines attempting to operate in the Philippine Sea transited in reverse. The commercial tankers operating from Subic Bay will conduct their resupply missions through or adjacent to this corridor. A persistent logistics presence of commercial vessels operating on irregular schedules because commercial operations do not follow military timing protocols adds acoustic complexity to an already difficult underwater operating environment. Planned submarine commanders maneuvering in the Luzon Strait must factor in commercial propeller noise, hull cavitation from multiple vessels in transit, and the surface traffic pattern changes associated with a more active Subic Bay logistics hub. That is not the primary purpose of the tanker basing arrangement.
It is a secondary effect that any competent Navy analyzes before finalizing a contracting decision.
Will Beijing revise its 21-day window assumption in its next generation of Taiwan contingency planning? Comment, yes or no. The revision is almost certainly already underway inside PLA war colleges, whether or not it surfaces in any accessible document. The Luzon Strait remains strategically contested in a way that the tanker contract does not fully resolve. Control of the strait, in the sense of preventing adversary submarine transit or surface group movement through it, requires a combination of undersea surveillance infrastructure, maritime patrol aviation, and surface presence that neither the United States nor China has deployed at sufficient density to claim dominance. The strait is 250 miles wide. It is one of the deepest passages in the Pacific. It is the contested seam in a contested theater, and the tanker contract changes the logistics architecture around it without resolving the underlying competition for control. Also unresolved, the Idaho basing arrangement at Cagayan remains politically contested within the Philippines. The coalition government that emerged from the 2025 elections includes partners who have publicly questioned the scope of expanded American military access. The pre-negotiated Subic Bay call rights assume a continued Philippine government commitment to Idaho basing that is not guaranteed past the 2027 review. The tanker contracts solve the logistics math under the assumption that the alliance architecture holds. They do not solve the alliance politics, and the logistics math requires the alliance to hold. One more unresolved variable. The DF-26 is the current anti-ship and anti-logistics ballistic missile of primary concern. The DF-27, with a reported range exceeding 5,000 kilometers and an advanced maneuvering re-entry vehicle designed to defeat Aegis-based missile defense intercepts, has been observed in flight tests. If the DF-27 reaches initial operational capability at scale within the next 3 to 4 years, the engagement geometry changes materially. The commercial tankers operating east of Guam would find themselves back inside the threat envelope of a system more capable than what they were contracted to complicate. The second island chain would no longer function as the outer boundary of credible PLA anti-access coverage. It would become the inner boundary. That transition has not happened. The rate at which it could happen remains an open question in every Indo-Pacific planning document written since 2024. Here is what the board looks like today, stated plainly. Military Sealift Command has contracted for logistics capacity that extends American surface group sustainment inside the second island chain by an estimated 30 to 40 days beyond what PLA wargame models have historically assumed as their working constraint. The contract was executed rapidly, justified by Fifth Fleet requirements from the Iran surge, and buries its Pacific deterrence function in procurement language most defense observers did not read past the headline number. The real audience, PLA Rocket Force planners and PLA operational staffs in Beijing, read it correctly. The signal landed without a press conference, without a carrier transit, without a diplomatic statement. The board favors American sustainment today. That condition is not permanent. China is building its own logistics fleet, expanding its own oiler capacity, and securing its own forward access arrangements through agreements in Cambodia, Djibouti, and ports across the Indian Ocean arc. The geometry of the second island chain is fixed. The number of ships that can operate inside it for how long and at what cost is a variable that both sides are actively contesting with procurement decisions, basing negotiations, and doctrinal revisions that will not make the news cycle, but will determine the actual balance of power in the Pacific theater for the next 15 years. A contract notice in a government procurement database moved more strategic weight this month than any single carrier transit. The carrier makes the news. The contract rewrites the war game. 10 tankers, 90 days. And the PLA Rocket Force's targeting model for the second island chain now requires a rewrite no single missile program can answer. The carrier sailed. The contract stayed. The gap between those two facts is where deterrence lives.